address this very important issue of gender. Of course, as you know, from CRFM's perspective, our ministerial council, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, had endorsed a statement about gender, issue of youth involvement and provision of decent work into all accountability by all our programs and policies and plans and so on. So moving forward, you know, from this project, the CRFM will be, these are issues that have to be at the forefront in all of our work. And so in all of our work, when it comes to accountability, we have to bear this in mind. Gender is cross-cutting, the involvement of youth for the sustainability of the industry, looking to youth for the future of the industry, where it's going to go into the 21st century. We have to use this, what we are learning in these sessions, to actually help us to move forward for better accountability and better impact in these areas. And of course, in addition to the ministerial statement, we have gender is also included. It's a key component of our small-scale fisheries protocol, which is in line with the relevant international fisheries instrument. So I just wanted to share those thoughts at the start. And of course, when Peter and Milton join, Milton will deliver formal remarks on behalf of the CRFM. We also want to increase visibility because by increasing visibility, we are also going to communicate to the communities that follow our work that we are very serious about addressing gender. So we will be also working to increase visibility following on from the work that we are doing this last week and also this week. So thank you very much for giving me those few minutes.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Susan. And that was Susan Singleton from the CRFM Secretariat. So thank you for those remarks. Peter, I see that you're joined now. Did you want to add anything right now, or would you like to wait until the end of the session?
Well, first I'd like to tender my apologies. I got my wires crossed. It's totally mea culpa. No, I think Dr. Singleton, the Deputy Executive Director, has, I think, said all that I might have said. I would have welcomed you on behalf of the Executive Director and her. I would have mentioned that I was happy to see the turnout and spoken to some of the things that I captured her saying, primarily reference to the ministerial decision on gender that this activity is actually a part of. And I would have actually acknowledged the financial assistance provided by Global Affairs Canada and the implementation, facilitation of this activity by the CLME Plus project implementation unit. Apart from that, there's nothing else that I would have added. Thank you, Dr. Singleton, for jumping in there as you always do to save my unmentionable, and also apologies for being late. That's it.
Not a problem, Peter. Thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you again, Dr. Singleton. Yeah, we would also like to extend our thanks to CRFM and the, proceeds that were, or the funding that was given to make this initiative possible. And so, we're very grateful for the CRFM Secretariat's direction and kind of drive to make this initiative happen. Okay, so thank you so much for both of you for those remarks. So last week in our session, we talked about, session one, we talked about kind of the terminology of gender and gender equality, gender equity, gender mainstreaming, and just trying to get all of us, kind of at this base of, okay, these are what we always hear about. And so what can we do about it? And we heard from Molly about gender inequality. We heard from Melissa about the gender and fisheries linkages, and Margot gave us an overview about gender responsive approaches in the project cycle. And then on Thursday, we were joined by Dr. or Professor Rhoda Reddick and Miss Toni Broadberg from UN Women, two Caribbean gender experts, and we had an amazing discussion with them on Thursday. That session was also recorded, and if you weren't able to join, I highly encourage you to go watch the recording. It was a great discussion, and we got a lot of really wonderful resources from them, so that we can broaden our understanding of gender inequality and what we need to do to progress on it. So let's see. So this week on this session, we're kind of bringing everything together. We're kind of bringing everything together where we want to start off this session by talking about what are the findings of the Gender Mainstream Initiative. So since February, the consulting team for CRFM has been, collecting information, doing a lot of stakeholder consultations, and reading and talking to people, interviewing people, and doing these sessions in order to kind of come up with the priority areas for gender mainstreaming in fisheries with due consideration to decent work and youth empowerment, and kind of what we can do about it. And so this week we're going to talk about that, and our first goal is to share the findings and the results from the research that we conducted under the initiative, including the draft CRFM 5-year Gender Action Plan, which many of you may have had an opportunity to review. I understand it's still, going through all the processes it needs to. But we'll share kind of our findings on that. And then our second goal is to talk about what we can all do and support you all in gender sensitive indicator development and monitoring evaluation for gender mainstreaming in fisheries. So we're looking forward to our discussion today. And we're really looking forward to the end of the session where we have these breakout groups and we can all come together and kind of talk about our challenges, our best practices, our ideas, and really start to get some of these initiatives and the activities going. All right. So let's start off with kind of the findings and analysis from the Gender Mainstream Initiative. And like I said, this has been going on since February 2020 under CRFM's guidance, and many of you we've talked to over the last couple of months, trying to just get all the information that we can to build up this analysis. So we talked about this last week as well, but an important start and where we started in this initiative was a gender analysis. So this is another polling question I'm going to ask. And again, these are anonymous, so feel free to answer however you'd like. But how familiar are you with the process of conducting a gender analysis? And maybe you've heard about it or you've read them, but maybe you've never conducted one, and that's okay. Or maybe you don't know all the different steps, and that's okay too. So we're just going to give you a couple seconds to answer. Okay. All right, thank you for everyone who answered. And we'll see, somewhat familiar, a little familiar, maybe not that much, and that's okay. So we're just going to kind of go over what a gender analysis is and why it's important in our work, and kind of the different questions that we go about when we're conducting a gender analysis. So thank you for answering that poll. So a gender analysis examines the different roles, rights, needs, concerns, and opportunities of women, men, boys, and girls, and the relations between them within a different context. So how we interact with one another, how our gender influences the rights we have, the opportunities we have, the access we have. And a gender analysis is really just trying to find that out and just trying to create a background of information for us to work off of. It helps us determine effective strategies in a particular context that will support gender equality and the empowerment of women within our projects. And that's why it's such an integral part at the very beginning. If we know how gender dynamics work within a certain context and kind of the available opportunities to close those gender gaps and to promote gender equality, we really are promoting more effective projects and more effective outcomes, as well as, you know, gender equality. So it's really a multi-benefit process. So yeah, last time when we talked about being aware of gender dynamics in promoting a gender responsive approach, you know, a gender analysis is helping us be gender aware. So it's really an important kind of starting point for us to really understand what's happening within a particular context. Because as we talked about last week too, gender dynamics differ wherever you are in every single context, from, you know, very local to national to regional levels. Excuse me. So just to kind of like talk about gender analysis domains a little bit, if we really kind of simplify it down, a gender analysis is just us asking questions. So we consider our sector that we're working within, and this one, it was fisheries, and we just ask questions, and we try and answer those questions as best we can through different research methods, such as consulting with local stakeholders, gender machinery, fisheries experts, different papers. We read a lot, all these different things to try and answer these very, you know, basic 5 questions. I'm gonna boil it down to 5. So the first is, what is the context? So we want to understand the laws and policies related to gender, natural resource use, economic access, etc. So maybe we look if there's a national gender policy, and if it addresses those equal access to resources, or, you know, equal rights to land, equal rights to economic, like income access, all these different things. And we also may find that there's gender action plans in different sectors. So the gender action plan developed for CRFM will become a, you know, resource for other people to know that CRFM is dedicated to this action, and that they can be kind of consulted with when, you know, different initiatives are happening within these regions. So, excuse me. We also want to know what the norms and values related to gender are in the first place. So less about like the laws and policies, like maybe nationally or locally, and more about what's happening on the ground, like how we might talk to a gender machinery or gender groups and ask about gender related concerns and issues in society. So the next question is, who does what? So this includes the data on division of labor, you know, how many men and how many women, and different age groups are involved in different sectors, and, you know, are they receiving income for their work? Are they engaged in informal employment? You know, and how are household tasks kind of addressed and divvied up in societies between women and men, and in communities as well. So the third question is, who has what? So this concerns maybe who has rights to own, manage, and inherit resources or bequeath them. And we may consult with community groups and ask how many people receive, like, or how people receive information, you know, whether that be through church groups, or, you know, maybe it's radio or TV, or, you know, the schools, parent-teacher meetings, these different ways that people access communication, so that we can best find out, you know, how people have these resources, how they interact with them, and we can better communicate and better reach different people. The fourth is who decides. So this includes both at the household level, the local level, national level, international level, who's involved in decision-making processes. We see a lot of statistics about the percentage of women and men in national parliaments, for example, or, you know, the number, the importance of gender balance in local community natural resource like management groups. So we, you know, that's, and like how in the household, like who manages big purchases, or who manages, you know, the decisions about how household resources are, you know, the inputs are changed, for example, like agricultural inputs and different methods. And then the fifth question is who benefits? So how are women and men benefiting from the opportunities presented to them? This includes, you know, who receives the payments for payment for ecosystem services schemes, for example, but also who is able to access kind of the different trainings and skills opportunities that there are in societies, and who gains the income from when, you know, different products are sold or different household management styles are. So those are kind of like the 5 basic questions that we ask under a gender analysis. And like I said, you'll be getting these slides along with the recording of this, and we'll also provide some different resources so that you can like look a little bit more at those domains. And this is just kind of like the basics of like 5 questions to ask when doing a gender analysis. So for the CRFM, we did a gender analysis strategy and action plan, or ASAP, a CRFM gender ASAP. And to do this, we used desk research. We analyzed the regional gender context in relation to fisheries, including as related to youth empowerment and decent work. We looked at country compliance with relevant international and regional frameworks. So kind of that, what is the context question, and the identification of emerging regional trends and priorities in fisheries related to gender, youth, and decent work. And we used various methods. You know, COVID came right at the beginning of this project. You know, global, like national and governments were reacting to the global spread of COVID-19. And so while we originally intended to be in person, we had to kind of switch up our methods. So that's why we're all here today on this virtual session, but we used different methods to conduct our gender analysis. Such as desk research. We surveyed people, we held extensive stakeholder consultations during the month of April and May with all sorts of people, and now we're doing this to talk to you all a little bit more and to share our findings. And so today when we're talking about this, we're going to kind of talk about our findings within the context of those 5 questions of the gender analysis and how our work kind of helped us come up with these priority areas for gender mainstreaming in fisheries. So to start off, I want to talk about that, what is the context question? So, you know, an important part for looking at the region was to understand, or for the CRFM member states, was to understand how CRFM member states were interacting with these kind of international and regional standards on gender, on fisheries, on youth, and on decent work. And so we came up with this we looked at the country compliance or adherence to these different frameworks. And so you see on the left side, we have the international ones that we looked at, and then on the right, we looked at these different regional ones. And there are many sound international and regional frameworks in place in the Caribbean, linking gender and youth and decent work in fisheries. And these are some of the frameworks that we looked into, and I'll talk a little bit more about them, in some of them in detail, but you can look at the report with CRFM where we looked at all of these in detail and kind of explained these different linkages that are there. When we looked at these, we thought about if there was a compliance mechanism in place. So is there national reporting that needs to be done, or is there, you know, some kind of body that does a review of different policies? And you know, if there was any linkages within the text that was guiding parties on linking gender in fisheries or decent work in fisheries or youth in fisheries, or, you know, a combination of all of these together. And then we looked at how countries were addressing these linkages, you know, in their reporting. Were they talking, or the national mechanisms talking about, you know, the importance of looking at youth in unemployment, for example, in fisheries? So these are just kind of some of the questions that we asked. So to start off, I just want to know, and this is another poll, so I'm going to open it up right now. But I just want to know if any of you are familiar with any of these frameworks. So the international frameworks, we're just going to focus on international right now. So I've opened the poll now, and if you're familiar with any or all of them, you can select as many as apply. And this includes the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, CEDAW, which is, if I, this acronym always gets me, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Beijing Platform for Action, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the International Labour Organization's labor standards, the World Program of Action for Youth, and the Lisbon Declaration, and the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries with FAO. So I'm just going to give you a couple more seconds to look at that and answer it. Thank you for everyone who's answering right now. Okay, great. So it looks like we, definitely the SDGs, a 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a, very internationally recognized and something that pops up a lot across sectors because of how cross-sectoral and how cross-cutting it is. So it's good to see a lot of you are familiar with that. So thank you for sharing, for answering that and sharing with us. Okay, let's see. So let's just move on a little bit to what do these linkages look like in these different frameworks, excuse me. So I'm just going to go through a couple here. And like I said, the report is going to be available on CRFM's website later on this year. So you can look at the full report where we talk in detail about all the ones that we listed on the previous slide. But for now, I'm just going to go through a couple so that you don't have to listen to me for too much longer, and we can get to the good stuff. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, this emphasizes the integrated action and coordination in implementing commitments across sectors. So there's goals on health, on gender equality, on eradication of poverty, on sustainable cities, on marine life, like life below water and life on land. So it's a really cross-cutting framework, and it's internationally kind of set the standards for what we as a global community want to see going forward into our future. And it's setting the standard for what equitable development really looks like. And it gives countries and states kind of goals and targets and guidance to realize those that kind of internationally agreed upon priorities, including for securing, oh goodness, I can't talk this morning, securing sustainable fisheries and gender equality. So gender equality is a cross-cutting priority of the SDGs, and we see that to varying extents that's been implemented. Let's see, and then CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So Tony Broadber and Professor Reddick on Thursday talked a lot about the SDGs and CEDAW. So again, I encourage you to go listen to that recording if you haven't, if you weren't able to join the session, or if you haven't listened to the recording, because Professor Reddick especially is on the committee for CEDAW, and so is very knowledgeable about the importance of CEDAW within our national and local contexts for furthering global gender equality. So CEDAW was signed in 1979, I believe, and it's really considered kind of the International Bill of Rights for Women. And even though it was signed in the 70s, it still plays such an important and integral role in furthering gender equality. And a big part of that is that it's legally binding. It has kind of it has a mechanism in place where if states aren't adhering to CEDAW, and all of the CRFM member states are signatories to CEDAW, there are ways for community groups, for women's organizations, for youth to bring grievance to non-compliance of CEDAW. And so it's been a really important mechanism in place to further kind of national adherence and compliance to globally recognized needs for rights. And the CEDAW committee, it plays an important role because even though the convention is from the 70s, the CEDAW committee continually promotes and produces guidance for kind of how the convention applies to these different areas of our work. These are called general recommendations. So general recommendation 34 is particularly important for fisheries, where it says that It considers land, natural resources, including water, seas, forestries, as well as fisheries as integral to human rights. And in that general recommendation, it also talks about the FAO voluntary guidelines for securing small-scale fisheries, or the SSF guidelines. And the SSF guidelines, I mean, obviously they're voluntary, it's in the name, but they are also, you know, coming from FAO, they're built upon guidance. Sorry if you can hear my cat, he's wanting to, he has some things to say too. And they're built upon kind of international best practices and guidance for what it means to, for sustainable development of small-scale fisheries. And importantly, gender equity and gender equality are core objectives and guiding principles of the SSF guidelines. So if you're not familiar with these, if you're interested in fisheries, oh, there he is. You know, please go check them out because it's a very important, right, buddy? He's not part of the practice session, sorry about that. Yeah, anyway, we'll move on. So why are all these international standards important? Well, our national governments sign up for these, they sign on to these conventions, they promote these conventions, the SSF guidelines are promoted among, you know, fisheries stakeholders. And really when we start looking at the text of these and we start looking at the guidance, and like we just mentioned, there's linkages between our different areas of work. And so if we leverage and if we identify these synergies, we're really, you know, strengthening our ability to hold our governments accountable and our stakeholders, or our kind of decision makers accountable, our policymakers accountable. It provides guidance for us to work together to maximize kind of those human potential and the resources available to us. And it helps us mobilize funding. All the major international environmental agreements, including the UN CBD and the UNFCCC, all have gender action plans in place. They've committed to understanding that gender equality and women's rights and women's empowerment is important to meeting the international environmental goals. And similarly, GEF, GCF, all the major international donors also have gender mandates in place, and to receive funding, you need to prove or like show that you're working on meeting those gender mandates. And so when we identify those linkages, we can really kind of like, I guess like make progress on multiple fronts. Not only are we showing that we're adhering and that we're making progress on these different international frameworks, but we're also, you know, making our policies more effective, we're aligning and amplifying the impact of policies, and we're leveraging support for synergized efforts and coordination across all sectors. Okay, so I've been talking a lot, and I apologize to my colleagues if I've been over time a little bit, but so I am going to stop talking here, and we're going to kind of go into the next section where we're going to talk about how in our process we came up with these priority issue areas using the information provided by you all, provided by CRFM and the desk research. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Luna, who will talk us through this section. Melissa?
Hi, this is Margot, actually. I'm going to jump in really fast before we have Melissa share this great section to address on your question around do we include other genders besides men and women, girls and boys. And yes, we are certainly transitioning, I would say, in the space where we work as gender equality advocates. We have been advocating for that language and support and integration for a longer time now. And thankfully, there is much more recognition around the need to have more inclusive language so that we do talk about gender more as a spectrum, and that is not a binary female, male, sex, but or the gender between the spectrum is that it can be very fluid. It is dynamic. We spoke much more to this in our session last week as well, so I would encourage you to check out last week's recording and can learn more about that there. But we are certainly, I would say, you know, the fact that you're even asking this question is very encouraging to us, because we know then that enhanced language has really supported a more inclusive approach for all people to be considered and have their needs and priorities met and addressed. And we certainly looked at that for this analysis and in our research. It's a pretty nascent idea, I would say, in the Caribbean, in a lot of development areas, but it is also making a lot of progress quite recently. And so we're very encouraged by that. And thank you for that question. And we are certainly including that. So with that, now, Melissa, I will hand it over to you. And thank you for the question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Margot. And thank you, Emmett. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Very happy to be here again with you all. So I will be walking you through some of the findings from our analysis, specifically the priority issue areas we identified for CRFM and member states for developing a gender mainstreaming strategy and action plan, and then talking about some of the challenges and gaps that we identified. Now, a lot of these challenges are very context specific, so some may not apply to your specific context or country. So after I run through them, we'll have a little reflection exercise where I'll give you about a minute or so to reflect on these challenges in your own specific context. And we'll use those reflections later on in our breakout discussions. So if you just want to have maybe like a pen and paper ready, or a Word document on your computer. It's also, you don't have to write down your answers, but maybe just think about them. So we can move to the next slide. All right. The priorities that we identified were based on comprehensive stakeholder consultations, in which we had a lot of discussions with some of you who are participating today from across the region. And also from what we gathered from a desk review of existing literature, available policies, projects, and initiatives on gender, youth, and decent work issues in the region. And I'll go into each with more detail and why each is a priority for gender mainstreaming, but first I'll introduce them. So the priorities that we identified are: 1, collect and analyze comprehensive sex disaggregated socioeconomic data; 2, strengthen understanding of the different social and cultural factors impacting labor and poverty of women, men, and youth in fisheries, and also gender responsive approaches to address these issues; 3, enhance cross-sectoral collaboration and knowledge generation on gender equality and youth engagement; and 4, engage with fisherfolk and develop appropriate methodologies for building their capacity on gender, youth, and decent work. Move to the next slide. Okay. Priority area 1, collect and analyze sex disaggregated data. So this is really the basis for gender mainstreaming, is having this data. And one of our key findings was that sex disaggregated data within fisheries is really limited across the region, and that there's also low capacity for collecting it. So for example, in some of the contexts that we were looking at, many fisheries surveys or censuses tend to collect data on fishers, but not as much on the processors or vendors who tend to be women and youth. And not having this information about their contributions can lead to continued marginalization of the work performed by these individuals, less access to resources, and just generally an incomplete picture on how the fishery is structured and how different decisions or policies may affect different actors along the value chain. There's also limited capacity to collect other socioeconomic data on registered fishers and fish workers and their families. And this can limit understanding of the dynamics and influences of their work in households, communities, and the sector at large. Lastly, it's difficult to track progress and inform equitable and effective and equitable decision-making and contribute to international progress on sustainable development. So like the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs that Emmett was just talking about, when countries don't have this information or understanding. And so with that, I wanted to give you all a minute here to reflect on some of the gaps and barriers that we identified in maybe jot down a few notes or just reflect on whether or not you see these challenges in your context, to what degree, or maybe there are some other challenges related to this priority area that aren't listed up here. Okay, so your minute begins now. All right. So hopefully some of those gaps and barriers look familiar to some of you, since most of these were based on the conversations that we had with folks throughout the region. So moving on to priority area 2. So strengthen understanding of the different social and cultural factors impacting labor and poverty of women, men, and youth. So we identified a number of different barriers, including that perceptions of gender equality and masculinity may be having an effect on the willingness of stakeholders to engage in gender responsive approaches in fisheries, including ideas that and notions that gender equality only concerns women, or that it equates to just gender balance and participation. Also, depending on their economic and social roles, women and men in fisheries have differing access to resources, and with that, their ability to cope with seasonal fluctuations or unexpected disruptions in the fishery sector is also different and not always equal. An example of this was in one particular context, processors and fishers didn't receive the same type of post-disaster assistance because of how they were registered with the fisheries division. So, and because there's a gender division of labor in these roles, where fishers are typically men and processors are typically women, this meant that women received less aid. There is limited research as well on gender-based harassment and violence in fisheries and fishing communities, and understanding how this is interlinked with fishing pressure, among other factors. And there's also a lack of engagement of youth in fisheries and a social stigma attached to the sector, in that many youth don't see fisheries as a prestigious area for employment or economic advancement. And we also found that fisheries education is not typically integrated in school curriculums, which could be a contributing factor to this stigma. And here it's important to note that when these issues are understood, we can better develop policies, projects, and initiatives that address specific needs and priorities of men, women, and youth, while also ensuring that these practices are culturally appropriate. And this can also help address any social issues that might hinder or prevent equitable outcomes, or other issues that may be contributing to this the social stigma of the sector. All right. So with that, hopefully these look familiar for you. I'll let you reflect on these challenges and just give you a bit of time to think about whether or not you've seen these in your context. All right. So I think we can move to the next slide. All right, so priority area 3, enhance cross-sectoral collaboration and knowledge generation. Now this is really important because it helps the uptake and integration of gender mainstreaming elements in different fisheries activities, such as conducting research on gender and fishing communities, or in drafting policies, establishing women's cooperatives, among other activities. However, we found that typically gender, youth, and fisheries issues are siloed and not integrated in other policies and plans, which can then limit the collaboration and best practice sharing between ministries, agencies, and institutions. Also, due to weak political will, lack of funding, and staff turnover, there have been a lot of mixed results in the effectiveness of gender focal point systems, which are there to help enhance cross-sectoral collaboration. However, we did observe in a few countries that there is increasing collaboration between the national gender machinery and fisheries, in which gender focal points were engaged as stakeholders in fisheries project and policy discussions. And in these cases, we found that this was primarily because of political interest and will at the highest level of government. So this is an example of what can take place when cross-sectoral collaboration occurs. These two agencies can really work together and collaborate to help integrate these issues. However, there are still gaps in the region for achieving this. And this then brings us to our reflection. So I'll give you all a minute to reflect on these gaps and challenges and whether or not you've seen them in your context. Also, apologies for any rooster sounds. Our neighbors have a bunch of roosters, so I apologize for that noise. All right, yeah. Okay, so priority area 4, engage with fisherfolk and develop appropriate methodologies for building their capacity. We came across a number of gaps related to this priority, including that fisherfolk are not meaningfully engaged early and throughout initiatives. Technology infrastructure, so things like internet access, can be a limiting factor for communicating and sharing information with local level stakeholders. Differentiated issues faced by women, men, and youth are not well integrated into local organizational structures and activities. And there's also limited recognition of and documentation on traditional knowledge and practices, which I'll be going into more detail in just a little bit. But this limited engagement is really a key issue because engaging fisherfolk and local entities and building their capacity and knowledge on gender equality really helps support all the other priority areas, and also helps build trust and social investment, and just overall supports more long-term successful and equitable outcomes. But all of this, of course, requires resources. So as we move into our reflection here, maybe kind of have this in mind when thinking about some of the gaps, barriers, or challenges in your context in for engaging fisherfolk and developing these appropriate methodologies for building their capacity. All right, so your minute begins now. All right. So I think we can move on to the next slide. So those were the 4 priority areas that we had identified. So we spoke with people from NGOs, from governments, and also regional organizations as well to identify these different priority areas. And another piece of our analysis was traditional knowledge. So we were also looking at traditional knowledge in the region and documenting gender differentiated traditional knowledge and practices. But first, what is traditional knowledge? Traditional knowledge is defined as knowledge and practices that are encoded in a society's oral history and cultural practices, and typically passed down within families over multiple generations. So I'm going to launch a little poll here. Yeah. So what does traditional knowledge include? Technical and ecological knowledge regarding fisheries, wave and tidal knowledge, climatological, nutrition, culinary, fishing and fish processing practices. All right, give you just a little bit more time. All right, great. Yeah, so great job, everybody. It is all of the above, which was actually already written on the screen there, but that's okay. Traditional knowledge includes a variety of different types of knowledge and practices about the environment, adaptation, and also cultural traditions. We can move to the next slide. Great. All right. So as mentioned before, we found that there is limited recognition of and documentation on traditional knowledge and practices in the region. However, we did uncover some practices which included women fishers in Dominica fish on foot using beach seine nets to catch titiwi. This fish has a strong cultural tradition, and its harvest is celebrated each year at the annual Titiwi Festival, where women also prepare the titiwi in traditional recipes, which also offers them an opportunity to earn income through the sale of these different dishes. We also learned that practices are changing. So there's a shift in the use of traditional bottom lines in pelagic fishing in Petite Martinique and Carriacou to long lining, which is moving fishing away from nearshore waters. We also found that traditional net mending and fish pot construction are dying crafts, and that women and men, are engaged in both, but men tend to dominate in net mending. We also found that there are a number of culinary and processing practices such as salting, smoking, and liming or curing fish with rock salts. And we found that these processing techniques are typically utilized within households and less in commercial practice, and also dominated by women, but that young men are also engaged in fish skinning and descaling. So these are just some of our findings. And even though our findings were limited, we do have more in our reports on traditional knowledge that we encourage you to read if you are interested. And also after the session, if you have more to add to this, we would welcome it, because naturally, as Emmett mentioned, we weren't able to go into the field to talk with more fisher folk about some of these practices and knowledge. But with that, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so our recommended next steps. Incorporating traditional knowledge and practices can be really useful for improving fishery management in general, because it can increase the voice and influence of fisher folk, so men, women, and youth, in policy and management decisions, and also increase gender equitable participation. Yet, as I mentioned before, one of the challenges for enhanced fisher folk engagements is that mechanisms for effective representation and integrating their knowledge is either non-existent or non-functional. So in response, our recommendations are to help facilitate the creation of formal mechanisms for capturing traditional knowledge, and also for encouraging fisherfolk to share that information and share these practices, share these traditions. Also to promote fisheries as an essential profession for food security and provide better services, and also pathways for economic advancement in the sector. So when there's a greater respect for the sector and the work that fisherfolk do, highlighting, not only its cultural importance to Caribbean people, but its role in island food security, traditional knowledge then has really great potential for being documented, for being passed on, and also integrated into fisheries management. And lastly, we recommend to conduct in-depth analysis to document the gender dimensions of traditional knowledge. So when we have a greater understanding of the gender dimensions of traditional knowledge, we can uncover these important gender dynamics that are really relevant for and relate to how individuals access and utilize resources, and also the specific challenges that women, men, and youth face in maintaining, enhancing, or passing on these traditions. Resource managers can also better understand how and through whom knowledge and practices are passed down, which can help identify and document different cultural norms or barriers to women's, men's, or youth's growth and advancement in the sector. And then lastly, as practices are evolving and changing, that was kind of a recurring theme that we heard due to a number of different reasons. But because these practices and knowledge is continually changing and evolving, documenting and understanding these gender differentiated knowledge and practices becomes really important for understanding how women and men in fishing communities respond, how they adapt to, and how they cope with stressors, particularly stressors such as climate change. So with that, I will pass it on to Molly.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Hi, everyone. This is Molly Gilligan. So I think we'll just take a quick moment here. If you're sitting at your desk, make sure you stretch your neck, stretch your fingers, maybe have a sip of your water, and then we will get going. Margot, is my video on?
Yes,
Okay.
I can see you perfectly.
All right, great. Okay, so thank you all for being with us this morning. We're so thrilled to be able to continue these discussions with all of you. With the finding and priority areas in mind, we'll now return a little bit to the process of gender mainstreaming. So here is the project and policy cycle again. In addition to enabling conditions comprehensively supporting broader gender equality, there must also be measures actively put in place to promote and integrate gender across all policy and program cycles. This process should be participatory, including all actors and stakeholders, to ensure progress toward gender equality. I want to mention that gender responsive M&E and impact and learning should all begin right at the beginning in the planning phase and be carried throughout the full project cycle. So gender responsive M&E, we could go to the next one. Thanks, Emmett. Gender responsive M&E considers gender actors in M&E framework development, equitable monitoring teams, stakeholder and beneficiary groups, disaggregated data and information, including qualitative information. As mentioned, a gender responsive M&E framework should be developed during the initial planning phase of a program, integrated throughout implementation, and completed along with the learning and knowledge sharing plan as the program closes. A gender responsive M&E framework is intersectional, considering the various factors that contribute to a person's identity. Collecting information that can be sex disaggregated, as well as disaggregated with various other relevant intersectional factors, including age, is one key component of a gender-responsive M&E framework. However, gender-sensitive data, data collection, and indicators also extends beyond sex disaggregation to be able to tell a full story of the different ways men, women, children, and all others interact with and rely upon their environment, so as to explore the various ways community members have been impacted by the program. So let's consider a few challenges and barriers to gender-responsive M&E, as well as solutions. Gender considerations are often added as an afterthought. Instead, gender should be integrated at the onset. If gender is being added afterwards, we could consult with a gender specialist to analyze and identify entry points. There's often a limited understanding of gender issues. This can be addressed in part by investing in capacity building. The importance of qualitative indicators is often undervalued. Both quantitative and qualitative indicators should be prioritized to be able to fully explore gender statistics. Additionally, there's limited available and accessible baseline data relevant to gender-responsive theories of change. All we can really do here is dive in and begin collecting data. Okay, so what exactly is the M&E framework? An M&E framework includes these components, which we'll go through in the following slides. There's a theory of change, indicator development, a management and reporting plan, an evaluation plan, including impact assessment, and a learning and knowledge sharing plan. Oh, and Emmett, I just realized I forgot to do the poll. Is it possible to add it now, or do we need to go to that original slide?
Oh, we can start it now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we'll do a quick poll just so we can get an idea of how familiar you are with M&E and if you also have experience with gender-responsive M&E framework. Okay, we'll give you a few more seconds, and this will give us an idea of what level of detail we should be going into also. Okay, thanks everyone for responding. So it seems like we really have a wide range of experience here with both M&E and with gender-responsive M&E. So some of you who are a bit more familiar with basics of M&E, some of this you might already know, or you might also do it your own way. I will mention that there's a lot of different ways to approach M&E, and also donors and partners often have their own requirements. So we will share this approach, which is pretty universal, though everyone might tweak it a little bit differently. And it looks like most people are not familiar with gender-responsive M&E, so I'll be sure to highlight some areas where gender can play, where you can better incorporate gender into your M&E framework. Okay, so these are the aspects here. So the last piece is the learning and knowledge sharing plan. And we'll start right at the beginning with a description of what a theory of change is. So a theory of change should be developed for the program. A theory of change outlines the goals of the program in terms of changes that the program can bring about. So for example, you might be trying to enact changes in attitudes or beliefs, changes in the capacity of stakeholders, or changes in policies or legal frameworks. This will guide not only design and implementation of a program, but will also guide M&E. I'll add just another reminder that gender-responsive M&E should be a participatory process. So partners, stakeholders, and beneficiaries should be consulted in developing this theory of change, as well as indicator development. Okay, since we have a wide range of experience with M&E, I'll just give a very quick background of types of indicators that might be considered. So for this, we'll talk about context and performance indicators. Context indicators measure the impact, context indicators measure aspects that are out of the control of the program, but they may impact your results. So it completely depends on the type of program you're doing, but it might be, for example, annual rainfall or school enrollment, information that you collect from third party, such as the World Bank. Performance indicators, or impact indicators, measure the impact of a program based on progress towards the goals or expected results. These include output indicators, which are those measured directly by the program. So, for example, number of workshop participants by sex, and outcome indicators, which are more likely to be measured by an external partner. So, for example, whether or not a gender focal point system has been put in place by a partner that you're working with. So we'll focus mostly on output performance indicators here. So for the value added of gender mainstreaming within M&E, a gender responsive framework with gender sensitive indicators is valuable because it makes visible what's currently invisible. It allows us to compare results. It shows that there is a tendency towards progress over time toward gender equality, and it can measure the gender-based impacts of a program. When developing a gender responsive M&E framework, gender sensitive indicators should be incorporated throughout. So they could be incorporated sort of however you're organizing your M&E framework. You can add gender components. And then these are some common categories where you would often find gender sensitive indicators. So a category on enhanced levels of gender equality in the fishery sector, capacity and knowledge building, you'd want to feature gender sensitive information there, policy development and support, and knowledge management and sharing. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these four categories with just a few examples. And the goal here is just to get you all thinking a bit about the type of gender sensitive indicators that might apply to your own work. We also have a ton more examples in the materials we're developing, but I've trimmed it down as much as I can to a few examples that I wanted to share with you all this morning. So for enhanced levels of gender equality in the fisheries sector, these are some things that you might consider measuring. The number of women participating in livelihood diversification trainings, number of women and men registered in formal economy production of the fisheries sector, number of women involved in management or co-management of fisheries, percentage of youth participating in the formal or informal labor markets by sex, number of women participating in fisheries, coastal, planning, professions, research at all levels. In the next section, for capacity and knowledge building, you might consider measuring the number of participants in capacity or knowledge building trainings or workshops by sex, number of organizations with improved capacity on gender mainstreaming within the fisheries sector, and this could be disaggregated, for example, by the type of organization. So whether it's a women's organization or fisheries organization, percentage of participants reporting increased understanding of gender equality by sex. So something like this would be measured by a pre and post survey workshop, for example. And you might also look at the impact of capacity or knowledge building for fisheries sector agencies and organizations. So development of gender focal points, increased budget allocated to gender-based activities, et cetera. And that would be more an outcome indicator that you might be asking your external partners to measure. For policy and development support, so it depends on what type of project you're organizing, but in the fisheries sector, you might be working with governments to help advance their policies in this sector. So if you have a section that's focusing on policy development, here are some ways that you can incorporate gender sensitive indicators there. So you might look at the number of governments supported to mainstream gender into fisheries sector policies and action plans, the number of fisheries policies or action plans adopted or updated to include gender considerations, extent of impact, integrating gender considerations in policy, or positive outcomes from developing or enhancing gender responsive policies. Okay, and the last category that we'll talk about, and again, just to mention that however you're organizing your M&E framework, there are likely entry points for incorporating gender sensitive information. So if you're looking at knowledge management and sharing, you might consider measuring the number of fisheries census surveys updated or expanded to collect sex disaggregated information, the number of knowledge products developed to support gender mainstreaming within the fisheries sector, number of presentations given to share this knowledge, or even the number of gender responsive, culturally appropriate methodologies changed, developed, updated for engaging with a diverse range of stakeholders. Okay, so when you choose indicators, this table is just to give you an idea of the type of planning that's involved in developing indicators for use. So you might be, you'll decide some indicators that are appropriate. You'll need to make sure that each have a precise definition, a rationale, all of these factors. So this also gives you a really good opportunity in organizing your M&E framework to highlight where you'll be incorporating gender issues. So for example, in the rationale, or also in the types of disaggregation that you'll be using. All right, and then the management and reporting plan. So now you'll see, I think, why it's necessary to really begin your M&E framework up front in the project during the planning and design phases, because there's a lot of planning that goes into M&E. Your management and reporting plan would answer some of the following questions. So who will be responsible for collecting information? What will be the sources of data? When and also how frequently will information be collected and reported? So will you be doing yearly reports, midterm reports, just one final report? Which indicators will be collected as baseline data? How data will be disaggregated? And also how this gender responsive M&E framework will be incorporated into the budget of your policy project or program. And then we get to the impact and learning phase. So this phase evaluates gender differentiated impacts, reports on gender progress, develops communication tools and knowledge sharing, incorporates capacity building, it takes time for reflection, and it enhances gender responsiveness. So your impact evaluation really is going to pull everything together. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a way to sort of organize all of your information. So you're going to start with your big picture, which is your theory of change. So for example, for the CRFM Gender Action Plan, which Margot is going to go into more detail next, we can consider organizing the information. And this is just one example, but a theory of change could be something like CRFM is committed to promoting and driving sustainable development solutions in fisheries that benefit from and contribute to gender equality, youth empowerment, and decent work in the Caribbean. So that would be sort of your big picture. Next, you would look at priority areas. So a lot of what Melissa just shared with us. So one example would be enhancing cross-sectoral collaboration and knowledge generation on gender equality and youth engagement in fisheries. And then under that priority area, you'd have your expected outcomes or results. One example might be CRFM gender fisheries focal points engage in trainings and have adequate support to resources to integrate gender responsive approaches in fisheries activities. And then once you get to that point that you have, you've outlined your expected results, the outcomes, then you want to find a way to measure progress against those outcomes. So you would look at the indicators you've been discussing and developing and pick the indicators that are most appropriate. And in the resources we're developing, we're sharing really big lists of indicators, but I also want to mention that you don't want to go crazy with how many indicators you have. You want to really tailor it specifically to align with measuring your goals. So for example, for this outcome that we've discussed, one indicator might be the number of gender fisheries focal points that have participated in capacity building workshops. So this is just a simple, hopefully, example to help you consider how to plan for impact assessment, reporting progress against your goals and priorities. Now, the last piece of the gender responsive M&E framework is the learning and knowledge sharing plan. So this is a super exciting part of M&E, I think. If you're reporting information throughout implementation, then this is giving you a chance to take time to learn lessons, to make changes, etc. So M&E supports efforts to learn from the successes or challenges experienced during implementation of your program. The M&E process can also be utilized as a tool for adjustments and improvements during implementation to enhance progress towards your goals. And then finally, knowledge sharing Knowledge should be shared with donors, partners, stakeholders, beneficiaries, and also other practitioners who are doing similar types of projects so that you can all collectively and continually advance outcomes. So at this point, you would be, with all this planning in place, you'd now be ready to enact your gender responsive M&E framework. And with that, I will pass it over to Margot.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, everyone. That was incredibly informative. It's always great to hear Molly speak about the data and monitoring piece. It's such an important piece of gender mainstreaming. And we think, you know, we're very aware that it is complex, and especially understanding how to integrate gender within that framework is complicated. And so, you know, just as a friendly reminder, that is why we are here. And actually, you know, part of our project for this was creating this gender action plan for CRFM of this project. And we really think that, you know, we wanted the analysis that was shared earlier in this session to have it be a major part of the project, and then have it inform, of course, this action plan. Identifying just those issues in the priority areas is not enough for gender mainstreaming. We have to be able to respond, that is imperative, for comprehensive gender mainstreaming toward gender equality in the fisheries sector and throughout. So we are excited that the CRFM is committed to promoting and driving sustainable development solutions in fisheries. And as Caribbean states design and implement sustainable development approaches in fisheries and aquaculture, equitable consideration and participation of women, men, and youth in approaches will help to maximize the socio and economic benefits that women, men, and youth can receive in response to environmental degradation, and also in strengthening food security. And so to support these efforts, we have made sure to create this 5-year gender action plan. It is part of a larger document, which was shared earlier as well, that is comprehensive of the analysis findings, and we've called it the Gender ASAP. We thought it was a pertinent name. It is supporting gender mainstreaming, and its aim is to support gender mainstreaming in fisheries through gender responsive approaches. And it's facilitated through enabling conditions, and which we discussed last week. And we want to make sure that it is part of the capacity building process for this, because we need to understand how all of the institutional arrangements, information sharing, and all actors can be a part of this to integrate gender into their work. This is an opportunity to look at what exists and build on what we have already in place in the region and for gender equality and in the fisheries sector. We do not need to recreate the wheel to mainstream gender. Gender mainstreaming is often, but doesn't need to be, perceived as an additional component to sustainable development and fisheries activities. We, of course, though, don't want it to be siloed, and it shouldn't be considered as a box-ticking activity. And so to have these gender measures actively integrated into existing structures and systems, programs, and enhanced results will ensure that it will have enhanced results for the fisheries sector. And so the 5-year Gender Action Plan for CRFM outlines our regional and national activities that will contribute to meeting the strategic outcomes for the region based on the 4 priority focus areas and priority areas that we shared, which highlight the challenges and barriers, and as such, the need for addressing these challenges. And we want to make sure that we are holding on to this momentum that has been created around gender mainstreaming by CRFM and the region, to make sure that we can continue on in this integration. The focus areas are not presented in an order of priority that we're going to share shortly, but each are important for ensuring gender is effectively mainstreamed in fisheries. So that is an important component to keep in mind. Each includes the activities toward achieving these strategic outcomes, as well as suggested indicators to assess the impact of implementing the activities in the focus areas. And a recommended time frame is included within the gender action plan that we have drafted. However, I'm not going to share those details today, but keep in mind that it is a 5-year action plan and there are several milestones over those 5 years. We've indicated different activities for different actors and stakeholders for this gender action plan, with the CRFM Secretariat having those activities be more at a regional level with appropriate coordination and convening power and delegation as is necessary for the activities, such as to the CRFM Ministerial Council. And the activities may be supported by other regional mechanisms, institutions, and organizations that have a vested interest in the mainstreaming of gender in fisheries and, as a stake in this action plan, such as some of the participants in these workshops from CARICOM, UN Women, Nature Conservancy, University of West Indies, and also the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. And of course, this work is all intended to be done with and in full consultation and implementation support of local actors, including the national organizations, fisher folk cooperatives, and individual fishers. And so we're going to briefly run through the focus areas and the actions associated with them. Many of you have seen this and had an opportunity to review already, but do keep in mind that this action plan is a final draft and is still pending approval by the CRFM hierarchy mechanisms. So to reiterate, yes, let's dive into focus area 1. This one you'll kind of recognize is linked with our priority areas, right? So this focus area is around data collection and expanding socioeconomic data and information. Our actions, so these regional strategic outcomes will support, we'll come to these outcomes following the actions that are implemented as part of the action plan. They will contribute to increased coordination on sex disaggregated socioeconomic data and also strengthen regional capacity on socioeconomic data collection. We will also, this will lead to socioeconomic data on fisheries in the Caribbean and more representatives of actors along the entire fisheries chain. Go to the next slide, please. Sorry, it didn't update. And so these are the activities for the first priority area, focus area. These are looking at coordinating design of data collection guide and frameworks, and at the national level, supporting context-specific indicator development and reporting on this. And these activities will then lead to the outcomes. Emmett, can you skip to the next one? Yeah, great, thank you. And then for the second focus area around labor and poverty impacts, some examples of the actions are around capacity building and tool development to support gender mainstreaming, such as gender analyses that Emmett went through earlier. And at the national level, we'll need to actually implement and conduct those gender analyses to ensure that the findings are relevant to the specific situation and context of each nation state. Whereas this analysis is very regional and broader in scope, we think it's very important to have the actions really grounded in the national context as well. And the strategic outcomes of these activities aim to achieve regionally strengthened capacity, again, of course, and that the differentiated roles, responsibilities, and priorities for women, men, and youth involved are documented and shared, and so that will inform the policies and programs that are being designed. This also has cross-sectoral approach and support to understanding also climate change as not necessarily an emerging issue, but much more recognized and necessary to have it be integrated within the climate change programming as well, with fisheries and supporting livelihood aspects of that from analyses that will be conducted. Another strategic outcome is to have the activities support recognition and understanding of the fishery-specific drivers and impacts of gender-based violence in the workforce and households, and how that can inform appropriate responses and mitigation strategies. So again, having those national level analyses will really ground the processes going forward in the countries and what is actually taking place there. And for the third focus area, the cross-sectoral collaboration on gender equality and youth is our focus. And the activities include really more comprehensive integration on gender mainstreaming across different sectors. And so with that, we're looking at financing, how to support the integration with, of course, financial resources. So how to support gender-based, gender-responsive budgeting, and also capacity building for how to be doing that and integrate that into your budgets as fisheries offices, but also as institutions. And then this is a very important point to include the gender advocates and gender experts here, as well as the gender machinery specifically. And I'm very happy to see that we again have participation from the gender machinery from a few countries. This is absolutely integral to mainstreaming gender so that that collaboration and connection, communication about what is happening on both sides can be understood and then worked on together comprehensively. And then this also includes the establishment of gender focal points, which has been somewhat in place in some countries, usually is run by the gender bureaus, but we have actually already, as part of this initiative, been able to identify and have gender focal points in the fisheries divisions. And so many of you who are online today have already been asked to take on that role. Getting a smiley face from Peter, that's excellent. And we're already, having the capacity building sessions to support their understanding and enhanced role on gender mainstreaming within the division specifically. And they'll be a critical part to maintaining that momentum I was speaking about going forward at the national level specifically. This also means raising awareness on the linkages of gender across the fisheries sectors. And an important piece of that is communications around gender mainstreaming, developing communication strategies, but different tools on what the different impacts and issues and responses and opportunities are for gender in fisheries is very important as well. So we're really reaching a wider audience of stakeholders, a wider audience, public as well, is very important to include in this. And I just want to bring up actually one of the comments, Ian, I saw you made in the chat earlier about how one of the biggest barriers is the human and financial resources for integrating gender. And that is, of course, true. We could not agree with you more. And this focus area is really trying to get at that. So how do we make sure that the right people are in the room and having a part in the decision-making and participating to ensure that we can pull from all corners what is happening and ensure that the most synergistic and comprehensive approach is going forward, that we don't have to duplicate these activities. And having the gender machinery involved is very important. I also think that it's particularly important to have this cross-sectoral collaboration and understanding around budgeting and having that allocation, but also keeping in mind here that donors, are pretty much all donors are mandating to have gender integrated at this point. And so it's actually an opportunity to perhaps leverage better financing for activities on fisheries. If you can demonstrate that there's been all this work on gender, we know that this integrating gender will lead to more efficient and effective results on fisheries and sustainable fisheries. And so if this work has already been laid down and is in process, I think it provides good impetus for donors to really want to enhance finances for that and then have additional resources specifically allocated to the gender activities. And so the outcomes for this then are very similar to a lot of what I was just speaking of, how having the gender machinery, women's rights advocates involved, that will lead to more sustainability in the fisheries sector. We'll have budgets that are gender responsive, having the gender focal points in the fisheries departments are already showing that we're building capacity and support for these processes, which is great. And then this also would provide for a system in place for cross-sectoral review of policies, proposals, and strategies. Proposals for projects that may integrate a really comprehensive gender approach with the gender machinery involved, women's rights organizations involved, that would then have a stronger outcome. And then the fourth focus area is around our key actors in fisheries, especially at the local level, to engage with fisher folk and to develop appropriate methodologies and tools for building their capacity. This will strengthen their engagement. To strengthen their engagement on this piece will then, of course, also have positive outcomes. But building their capacity, and then at the national level, working with them to document their knowledge on different traditional practices, like Melissa spoke about, is really important. And the different gender-sensitive elements of the value chain, and also again on that communication piece for how to raise awareness of what is being done. So that is a very brief overview of the activities that are included in the action plan. And you will notice that in each of these, where I ran through the outcomes for each, there was also an example impact assessment indicator, which is linked with what Molly was just talking about, of how do we show that we are having this impact. And it's important to recognize that this gender action plan is being developed and shared now at this point as a tool to integrate gender going forward in all of the different initiatives and policies and processes in the next 5 years, and hopefully in going beyond that as well with the next iteration of Gender ASAP. But that this is usually the gender action plan can be done at the onset of a project in the design or even the planning phase to really respond to that initial analysis. And we've talked a lot about how at the national level, we'll still need to do those analyses and then have a gender action plan formulated at the national level. However, we are actually trying to implement that step already. And some of you are already aware that we are going to be in the next few weeks supporting the national fisheries authorities to host national workshops to develop a national gender action plan in the fisheries sector in the priority Flyingfish countries, which were a part of this specific project. And so that'll be taking place, and that is where the analysis that has been done for this will inform those projects, with the idea that outlined in those action plans, still more specific analysis at the national level will take place. So that is just information to have us kind of start thinking about what we can do to develop those actions that could be included in national action plans. Melissa gave you some time to really reflect on the priority areas that we identified based on the stakeholder consultations and research with you all. And so now we want to provide an opportunity for us to just have a smaller breakout group discussion amongst ourselves with the different, those of us leading a conversation. And Peter, hopefully we won't drop you out this time. And so we're going to have a breakout group. We have only about 20 minutes for discussion, but to think about what was shared today, what are some of the elements that might have been surprising, and how we can think about the different challenges that were also introduced and opportunities to enhance gender, specifically thinking about at the national level for developing those action plans going forward. Apologies for that. So I'm going to break everyone into breakout groups now without further ado. And give me just 1 second. We realized the time though, so just wanted to provide a few minutes for closing and thanks.
Margot, we had a point that maybe you can actually just incorporate into your closing remarks maybe, but we had a point at the end that we didn't have time to dive into, but it was a point about basically how do you change the past for looking forward to the future? So kind of pushing up against some traditional norms or barriers, including for women actually getting out on fisher boats. So I don't know if that's something that you want to touch on, or it's also, I mean, it's a big question, so sorry to just plop it on you, but also I mentioned in my group that if there's anyone who wanted to respond to that question in the chat box, that would be great, because we'll also have, we'll be able to keep a record of responses in the chat box. So if anyone has any ideas about pushing up against traditional norms and challenging ways to improve moving forward, feel free to drop your comment in the chat box.
Sure. I love that we had some pretty deep conversations. We had a nice point also from Susan in our chat as well. And actually kind of a similar question came up in ours from Elaine, I believe, was is this action plan getting to transformative solutions? And kind of is the same thought in my mind, Molly, based on your question. And the response that I gave, and I will abbreviate it here, is that this action plan is not the be all end all. This is one tool in a hopefully very comprehensive toolkit with many, many tools, and that it is something that will continue to make progress. So when last week we spoke about the different kind of spectrum of gender equality, and we have gender sensitive, gender responsive, moving into gender transformative. And a lot of the space where we are, yes, it's taken a while for us to get here and really recognize gender equality needs to be integral to these development policies and practices, but we are making that progress. And so, we should all pat ourselves on the back. Maybe we haven't gotten there as quickly as we wanted, but we are working on it, and we are making progress. And the actions that are outlined in here are really more for creating more of a foundation and supporting what already exists and building on that, taking in those best policies and practices, integrating that across sectors, building the enabling conditions that will mainstream gender to then transition into activities and results that really are gender transformative, that are changing how we are what we're seeing on the ground between relations of women and men and non-binary folks. So that is what our hope is with this. This is a first iteration. We can build on this. There hopefully will be many phases going forward. And also, that this is a tool to integrate gender into the national fisheries policies or the fisheries action plans, that this shouldn't just stand alone. Also had that point made in our group, which is very important, so that this can be just one tool towards the future to support change in that regard. Hopefully that will suffice and kind of does work as a wrap up as well. I mean, we are so thrilled by the engagement that we've had from all of you throughout this entire process over the last 6 or 7 months. The stakeholder consultations, all of this information we gathered from you, and of course from research done also, but the consultation was absolutely integral to informing what this analysis and the findings we have from that, and then how we also built the gender action plan. And then of course, like I already mentioned, we will take that forward into the national level and supporting development of gender action plans in the fisheries sector there, encouraging its integration throughout all the different processes. So with that, very aware that the time is up and you all have stayed with us for 2 hours, which we really appreciate. Just want to thank you very much. Those of you that participated in last week's and this week's sessions will receive a certificate. So we appreciate that commitment to enhance your capacity on gender mainstreaming in fisheries. And also remember that we do have a session on Thursday, which we think will be really a fabulous session. A lot of what we've talked about today with the gender action plan, this tool, this policy piece, but in this webinar on Thursday, we're going to hear from people that are really on the ground integrating gender into their practices throughout the Caribbean in different ways. And I think there will be some really great insights to hear from folks of what they're doing to make sure that we are moving towards that gender transformation in the fisheries sector. So I also, of course, want to thank CRFM, and plenty of our CRFM colleagues are online today. Again, we really appreciate all the support that you've provided us throughout this entire process and in you know, also just recognizing and supporting having gender, this initiative take place to have gender mainstreamed in the Caribbean fisheries. And that this was provided by funding from Global Affairs Canada, implemented through a Global Environmental Facility project, the CLME Plus project. And so without further ado, thank you so much. We will be in touch with the recordings and resources, materials from these presentations, and also from the wider project as a whole in the upcoming days. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday and being in touch for national sessions. Have a great day.
Thank you, Margot. See you on Thursday, everyone. Bye.